All matter originates and exists only by virtue of a force. We must assume behind this force the existence of a conscious and intelligent mind. This mind is the matrix of all matter. Max Planck.
This video will be an exploration into the fundamental nature of the phenomenal world. In it, we will break apart our contemporary notions of matter and information in the aim of a refined understanding of spirit, which is a term that has largely fallen out of relevance in our current era. In doing so, we will touch upon contemporary physics and the works of various thinkers, including information theorist Claude Shannon, postmodern philosopher Jean Baudrillard, idealist philosopher George Wilhelm Hegel, and various others. This is an attempt to consolidate many of my recent thoughts and ideas on the matter, and as dense as it may be, I hope that it is nonetheless clear and of value. Without any further delay, let's fall into it. I'd like to begin with a question that can expand quite quickly. What is the difference between matter and information? Both terms are very relevant to our modern perspective, but they are often vaguely defined and ill understood. In examination of the former, we find that matter is a theoretical substance. It is held to be an ontic substance and may be regarded as that which gives rise to the phenomenology of our experience, the qualia of consciousness, the sights, sounds, and sensations which are aggregated into our subjective sense of being. I find the problem with this reveals itself upon asking the question, what actually is matter? You see, during the late 19th century, when much of our contemporary ideas on matter and an atomistic universe were still in their conception, we hypothesized matter to be fundamentally discrete, resembling small spheres which revolved around one another like planets in a Newtonian world. This atomistic model, formalized by Niels Bohr, was quickly shown to be wrong and inadequate. And in 1927, the first wave-like behavior of tangible matter was experimentally demonstrated for electrons by the French physicist Louis de Broglie, and soon thereafter would be demonstrated for other elementary particles. This meant that matter, which comprises the solid stuff of the universe, was shown to exhibit the same wave-particle duality of light that was discovered decades prior via the photoelectric effect. That same year of 1927 saw the inception of quantum field theory with Paul Dirac's famous paper on the quantum theory of the emission and absorption of radiation. It was here that Dirac coined the name quantum electrodynamics, which is now considered a subset of quantum field theory more broadly. Quantum field theory would go on to revolutionize our fundamental notions by positing that fields are the fundamental entities and not particles, which are understood as localized excitations in these underlying quantum fields, something perhaps resembling a sheet being poked, causing something of a definite entity to appear. This is indeed a departure from the preceding Descartian era, which saw reality through a metaphysical lens, of which looked at the world as though it was composed of elaborate clockwork mechanisms. In my previous videos on scientific materialism, we explored some of the works of Dr. Ian McGilchrist, and we observed that the functional divide of the hemispheres of the brain is oddly resemblant of this wave-particle duality, and that all phenomenality can actually be seen as either discrete or continuous. However, in my mind, by all accounts, what we have in quantum field theory today is an ontological conception of the world which could be said to be far more closely resemblant of the continuous substance first credited to Aristotle in the 4th century BCE. I am speaking, of course, of the substance called ether, which comes from the Greek word Aether, meaning upper air. The Greeks considered Aether to be the medium through which the gods communicated with mortals, and it was revered as the substance that connected the mortal realm with the divine. Here, the gods should not be understood in a purely anthropomorphic sense. They should be understood as synonymous with the celestial spheres or entities which revolve throughout the etheric vacuum of space. Indeed, it may be said that for the Greeks and most civilizations of old, the image of the cosmos was reflected within the consciousness or soul of man, and the likeness of man's consciousness was seen within the image of the cosmos. The cosmos therefore spoke to them. It carried whispers upon the winds, and as we'll explore later, it was equally understood through a kind of qualitative science, as opposed to the quantitative sciences of today. Thus, the Greeks considered Aether to be the medium through which the gods communicated with mortals, and it was revered as the substance that connected the mortal realm with the divine. Regardless of what one may think of this spiritual aspect, it seems apparent to me that the intuition of the Greeks, the medieval alchemists who would later revive this idea, and Isaac Newton's revised notion of luminous Aether were all largely on point. We now understand that the air which exists within the gravity well of the Earth is simply more dense or energetic excitations of this fundamental underlying field. Indeed, modern physics contends that the vacuum of space is not empty in any reasonable sense, but still consists of seemingly random fluctuations known as zero-point energy. Let us observe that if we are seeking what is ontically primary, then the discrete quantized stuff of our phenomenology, the particleness of this substance, is therefore subordinate to the existence of that which gives rise to it. Which is to say, if it were not for the excitations of the underlying field or fields, then there would be no stuff, and thus there would be seemingly no phenomenal experience, as we wouldn't exist. This field may therefore be held as ontically primary. In fact, it may be that the only thing which can really be said to exist is the field or fields themselves. Now, in hopefully having gained some contextualization of the term matter, in revisiting our original question of what is the difference between matter and information, let us possess the insight that unlike the notion of matter, the term information possesses a unique dimension to it, or at least it can possess this. Unlike an ontic substance, which may be held to exist independent of a mind, information is a term which can point to something partly immaterial or mental in nature. It describes the seemingly intangible and quantifiable relations of an ontic entity or entities. These quantities, which may be considered the information itself, are, in the final analysis, purely constructs of our mind. Therefore, the term information can denote a mental or non-tangible dimension of our phenomenology. For example, if one were to ask someone to point to the information of a pencil, where would they point? If they point to the pencil itself, are they pointing to the ontic substance of the pencil or the information of it? Are they one and the same? Indeed, is the information of the pencil located in or of the pencil itself, or is the information within our mind? Or perhaps both in some sense. Well, let's first examine the supposed ontic substance of the pencil. Is the pencil itself only comprised of the isolated excitations of the underlying field, of the particles which comprise it, or is something of the pencilness also contained in the unique spatio-temporal arrangement of all these particles, and even the zero-point fluctuations in between them, which may also have a say in the matter? I think we find that it is, and this seems to therefore imply that even these zero-point fluctuations, or what we might qualitatively identify as empty space, are also constitutive of the pencil itself. It's the whole package which makes the pencil what it is. Now, let us observe that all of these quantum mechanical systems can and are quantitatively described. This, in essence, is the ontology of physicalism, the birthchild of the Descartesian materialist legacy. The concern of physicalism is no longer what the substance is or is like, with its qualitative and essential descriptions, but rather it is concerned solely with the quantitative descriptions of whatever the fundamental underlying substance is. The issue with this view, to me, is that this has led to a weird state where very often when we refer to information, we actually blur the line between the ontic substance of the pencil and the quantitative properties which we ascribe to the pencil. Is the pencil the underlying substance, or is the pencil the quantities which we ascribe to the substance? It seems to me that physicalism cannot decide whether it wants to refer to the underlying thing, or simply wants to restrict itself to the measurements of the thing. I don't want to get too deep into the weeds here, as this is beside the point of the video, but this line of inquiry can easily cascade into many variations of dualism on the one hand, or some reductive epiphenomenalist views on the other, which might seek to preserve a rather material monist ontology. Any way you take it, this particular notion of the term information is perhaps best described as intrinsic information, and it is a notion proposed by folks like Giulio Tonini and the integrated information theorists, who hold that consciousness is information, and information is interchangeable with consciousness. Information is what therefore gives rise to our experience of consciousness, and in some sense it is held as existing independent of a mind, just as matter or the ontic substance is. Again, the line between them is rather blurred or muddy. As I briefly stated earlier, again, another peculiar observation here is that under this intrinsic information, the thing is still being described in terms of our mental constructs, of quantities and mathematical operations. These quantities are of our own creation, and I suspect few would suggest otherwise. They are our map of the territory, so to speak. It is our mind which is making sense of and giving order to the proposed ontic entity. Again, physicalism seems to be humbly admitting that there is no escape beyond the confines of our consciousness, yet simultaneously wants to hold that the pencil is made of something other than mind stuff, such as how it might be regarded in an idealistic ontology. Yet the fact remains, however, that we are still describing the ontic entities in terms of what is essentially a new kind of mind stuff we call information. Well, this leads us to another answer to the question of where the information of the pencil is located. In recognizing the aforementioned predicament, perhaps one would point to their own head, presuming that the information of the pencil exists within their brain, as it takes a mind to record a copy of the pencil in a similar way that a camera would. This view of the brain also appears to posit that it stores the memory of the pencil in a way which is resemblant of a computer. Now, I'm not necessarily convinced that this is how our minds actually work, at least not in entirety. But it does nonetheless suggest that the term information is fundamentally meaningless without a mind to capture the underlying thing. This appears as the idea that information is fundamentally a category of the mind and should not be held as existing outside of the mind or ascribed to an ontic entity. This is the view of American philosopher John Searle, who does not hold that there can be any such thing as information without a mind. Searle's view on the word information appears to be a variation of Claude Shannon's original notion of information, which was posited in his paper A Mathematical Theory of Communication in 1948, only 1 year after Alan Turing first described his concept of a Turing machine, which would mark the birth of computer science. Shannon's notion of information is essentially observer-relative information. In other words, it doesn't exist as information until an observer takes it in as information. It isn't dealing with the kind of information which might be easily taken as out there in the world in some sense. Thus, for the sake of clarity, we can call this kind of information observer information, as it stands distinct from the aforementioned intrinsic information. Corollary to this is the notion that the only pencil that we can know is the pencil which we record for ourselves. It is the pencil which our sense perception renders for us, the one which our consciousness creates for us. Let us observe that the moment that the pencil has been quote-unquote recorded, the true nature of it is already gone, if the true nature was even there to begin with. Indeed, a la Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason, what guarantee do we have that our senses are actually conveying the pencil as it really is? As we will touch upon later in this video, much of Western philosophy has grown a significant distaste for this kind of Kantian metaphysical ideation, which might suppose that there is some kind of transcendent version of the pencil within a noumenal or spiritual world, or within Plato's theory of forms. And I do think that there is some merit to these objections. However, in my mind, there is a much more glaring problem with this rejection of a speculative transcendent metaphysics. And that is, by rejecting these lines of inquiry, we actually run a potentially catastrophic risk of mistaking the map we have created for the territory itself. This is a topic that we will address now. Any way we slice it, this view of observer information appears to at least be cognizant of the limits of the mind. It does not run the same risk of confusing the information of the pencil for the ontic substance of the pencil itself. The only pencil which we are ever actually dealing with is the pencil our minds create. Everything therefore appears to be an imperfect copy, an imposter. This is the idea of the postmodern philosopher Jean Baudrillard in his 1981 work Simulacra and Simulation. He calls this phenomenon the procession of simulacra. Imagine that we have the person who saw the pencil describe the qualities of the pencil to someone else. It summons up an image within the mind, and we therefore have another copy of the pencil which likely has lost some resemblance to the original entity. One can imagine this process going on and on via something of a finite regress. This applies to every facet of our existence, to history, to science, to religion, politics, and so on. There is nothing within phenomenality that appears to be unaffected by this procession of simulacra. The present state of the simulacra is reality so far as we know. Every step along the way, we get further and further away from the original entity. Baudrillard rather cleverly conveys this with the opening of his book, which attributes the following quote to the Book of Ecclesiastes. "The simulation is never what hides the truth. It is the truth that hides the fact that there is none. The simulacrum is true." Now, this quote is not actually found in the Book of Ecclesiastes, but rather seems to be Baudrillard's interpretation of the book. The point he seemingly intended to convey was this: how many individuals would think to examine this quote to see if this held true? What Baudrillard wrote isn't necessarily untrue. Ecclesiastes is a book that addresses very existential themes, questions, and meaning and ideas of truth, and it could therefore be considered a reasonable interpretation. However, the issue here is not that it was necessarily an inaccurate misinterpretation, but rather the quote was attributed to the source text. Therefore, given that these kinds of conflations happen on a daily basis, often unintentionally, how many regresses of an interpretation does it take to truly destroy or harm the integrity of the original entity? How many of these little deceptions, of these seemingly insignificant mistruths, does it take to create vastly divergent simulacra of essentially separate realities? On a daily basis, how often does an individual consume information in this way, and by being unconscious of it is therefore deprived of control over their own reality in some sense? For many people, entire ancient empires and civilizations of history in all their immense complexity may ultimately be reduced to a simple idea, maybe a qualitative sensation of what it was like to live at the time, and a vague sense of aesthetics. What we have here is a map of a map replacing a map of a map, on and on forever until the original form is perhaps lost forever. Once you mistake the map for the territory, or even if you cease to try to retain the semblance of the territory, then reality is lost. For a civilization so spread across disparate simulacra, chaos and destruction seems the inevitable end. Now, with this theme in mind, let's re-examine the notion of intrinsic information. Let us again presume that the information of the pencil is within or of the pencil itself and not our minds. While we may acknowledge the quantities we ascribe to the pencil as our own mental constructs, as I mentioned earlier, the line between the ontic substance of the pencil and the quantities we created to describe the substance appear to be blurred. As philosopher David Chalmers has famously expressed in his formulation of the hard problem of consciousness, how do you get a world of qualities, of sights, sounds, and feelings from a world of quantities? Is that even possible? In my mind, these appear as two completely different dimensions of our phenomenology. Let us not forget that the world we are attempting to describe is one of our everyday experiences. The world of sensations, love, touch, and experience is the only world which we truly know. It is primary to our beingness, and existentially precedes our modalities of logic and reason. You see, one might say that the territory is our qualitative experience, the map is our quantitative description of the experience. The latter was created to explain the former. We break down a theoretical electromagnetic spectrum into various quantitative ranges to explain our sights and experiences. Certainly, at the very least, the latter was created to manipulate or change the former, as evidenced by modern technology. We may therefore say that this quantitative dimension is the mirror which reflects the qualitative dimension of our experience. It is a higher level abstraction away from our immediate sense perception. The issue of the line being blurred between the substance of the pencil and the information of the pencil appears to signify the gap or junction point between these two phenomenological dimensions. To expand on the aforementioned issue that I have with this, in my mind, this increasingly commonplace notion of intrinsic information drastically increases our chances of mistaking the map for the territory via precession of simulacra. We are taking a term which originally existed in the Shannon sense as observer information and are applying it to describe reality in ways we used to describe an ontic entity. To some physicists and philosophers well versed in these concepts, this may seem like a moot semantic concern. But at the very least, as we'll explore next, to the public writ large, I think we find the conflation of these terms rather problematic. We appear to be entering into a world where there is an increasing sense of inauthenticity and widespread uncertainty, we might say. There is a reason why ideas like Nick Bostrom's simulation hypothesis and integrated information theory seem to rise to the prominence in the cultural sphere. Indeed, in science fiction, the Matrix movies have become deeply iconic for putting into form something which deeply resonates within us. We live in an era in which seemingly everything is being questioned and reevaluated, from traditional values to staggeringly high rates of distrust in institutions in narratives of all kinds. If we attempt to reach into the zeitgeist of our era, I think we find that something within the dominant simulacra is not quite right. Something is off, and while it may often evade our conscious rational minds, it may not our unconscious minds. The truth always finds a way, it does so through the artist, the poet, the musician, the comedian, the speculative philosopher, and all those who might be said to have a relationship with their muse. Truth is always trying to find a path to the surface of our minds. If we must collapse this aberration of our simulacra into a definite form, it seems as though this simulacrum of a discrete quantized reality is at the end of the road. If there is any one essential unified reality anymore, then it appears as though it is quickly breaking down. It is about to be expelled from the collective consciousness of man, and the new is about to replace it in a Hegelian dialectic sense. Or perhaps it's about to transfigure itself into a unifying simulacrum far more continuous, indefinite, and virtual. You see, over the past centuries, roughly since the Renaissance and the beginning of the Enlightenment, it appears as though we have been slowly diverging from a cohesive shared reality ushered in by the Christos and maintained via the authority of the Church. We have been increasingly dissolving into disparate simulacra, breaking into smaller and smaller consensus realities. It seems as though the simulacra unifying power of the Church was dealt a fatal blow with the rise of scientific materialism in the late 19th century. That power was usurped by the empirical sciences that emerged, the discrete, scrupulous, quantitative modality of consciousness that it brought with it, one led by cutting-edge physics. It began to encapsulate our most basic ontological notions of what reality is, and indeed there is seemingly no greater power than this. It essentially amounts to the ability to manipulate entire realities, to spawn and dissolve entire simulacra at will. Since then, even these post-theocratic simulacra have begun to dissolve and divide. It is now obvious more than ever in our contemporary digital information age, which is filled with propaganda and hidden agendas virtually everywhere you look. People have drastically different narratives of what is happening in the world, what the world even is, what it's capable of, how it works, and so on. The word propaganda even fails to betray the true essence of things here. It doesn't even need to be an explicit political agenda by some institution. Simply by virtue of art, a video, or a meme, we are continuously separating into divergent realities. Is it therefore any surprise that for some, having sensed the cascading fissure in the firmament of the earth, have begun seeking answers in the areas which directly preceded our contemporary simulacra? Some today may come to see the value in such perspectives and modes of thought, yet it would still seemingly appear that within our culture at large, something of an ontological wedge has separated contemporary man from our ancestors. The value of their wisdom, knowledge, and understanding is still lost to us. We simply no longer speak the same language, as we no longer inhabit the same worlds. More so, our contemporary simulacrum is still dividing and evolving. When the computing revolution was born with Alan Turing's machine in 1937, a series of developments would follow which would lead towards a new set of metaphors and analogies which could be used to contextualize and cogitate about the world. Shannon's notion of information was seemingly grounds for a new mode of thought. And since then, just as within intrinsic information, which itself is a new application of Shannon's observer information, this notion of intrinsic information is seemingly splitting into a new form itself. For some, information is no longer seen as purely existing within our minds, but they take it one step further. This interpretation, I feel, is best exemplified in the intersection of the transhumanist movement and the proponents of the simulation hypothesis. The perfect example of this is perhaps the author of The Singularity is Near, Ray Kurzweil, whom I tend to see as the kind of techno-priest of an essentially religious movement, which seems to consist largely of secular humanists, science fiction enthusiasts, and many stripes of technologists and spiritualists more broadly. These individuals look towards the technological singularity through a religio-prophetic lens of a seemingly biblical nature. Central to what I'm presenting here, it would appear, broadly speaking, that this class of people see information not merely as contained within our mind in either the physicalist sense or the Shannon sense of the word, but rather holds that this information is essentially being computed on some kind of transcendent substrate or computer, perhaps beyond time and space. Reality therefore can be viewed as analogous to a simulation running on a computer. This movement appears to me as essentially the return of a spiritual or metaphysically transcendent worldview, except this time under the legacy of a materialist conception of the world. If this is the trajectory of things, this evolution of the physicalist ontology may seemingly become somewhat compatible with the many religions' metaphysical notions of gods, daemons, spirits, and all kinds of metaphysical phenomena which have been believed by virtually every culture in human history. Kurzweil has once described his view as pancomputational pantheism, the idea that computation and information processing are ubiquitous and inherent in all physical processes, which are manifestations of a unifying computational divine reality. Under such a pancomputationist view of phenomenality, one can easily reconcile the fundamental etheric field as informational vector space, similar to a simulation or video game. This, in traditional forms of spirituality such as those found in our current religions, are far more likely to see this as a dream field or the mind of God itself, expressed through the metaphor of our psyche or our beingness, rather than through the metaphor of a computer. One can imagine a future quickly arriving in which children are essentially raised in virtual and augmented realities. How quickly would the line blur between the direct phenomenal reality and the virtual layers built over it? How easy might it become for us to mistake the map for the territory and cascade into a simulacrum of a simulacrum, never to find our way back to the core from which we originated? How likely would it become commonplace that future humans would find it difficult to distinguish between the quote-unquote real and virtual? As Baudrillard conveys, for all epistemic purposes, the simulacra is true. It becomes reality. As you may have guessed, I am deeply wary of this potential trajectory which we may very well already be traversing. I want to be clear, I am not somebody who is against technological innovation and progress, but I am someone who feels that technology can ultimately be used for good or bad. However, what determines if these technologies will be used for good is perhaps ultimately dependent on the extent of our wisdom, and how that wisdom is reflected in our social structures, organizations, nations. And as someone who is by profession a software engineer, allow me to be the first to say that many of those who will be building these technologies and those who oversee those who are building them are more often than not fundamentally unwise. This is why I have a grave concern. More than innovations in technology, we need wisdom and foresight. Right now, more than logic, analytical skills, and criticality, we need intuition, insight, and compassion. More than material sciences, we need spiritual sciences. We need to be able to understand the nature of man's soul, without an empirically cynical criticality to tell us that these notions are unproven or fantastical. We need to be able to understand that there are different dimensions of man's phenomenology, and the development of one does not impede the other. We need to be able to understand where the limits of rationality, logic, and empiricism are, and where it finds its end, we must allow ourselves to let the heart lead the way. Consider the potential dangers of a transhumanist future. What right to confidence do we have in neurobiologically modifying ourselves to fit some ideal image of who we'd prefer to be? There is no guarantee that the world which our sense perceptions construct is even conveying the world as it truly is. If reality is as the pancomputationalists see it, then we are effectively trying to modify our programming without knowledge or access to the source code. We would therefore be attempting to modify our fundamental nature through a graphical user interface and not through the underlying logic gates and machine language. Indeed, there is great evidence, even scientific evidence, which I will link below, to strongly suggest that there is perhaps far more to what we can even know scientifically than what our dominant cultural understanding depicts. When we go to make such a modification, how many unforeseen side effects lay waiting in predation? It is a valid philosophical concern and not a dogmatic religious superstition, as many may cast it. You see, sometimes we simply need to believe things, even if we're not quite sure why at a rational level. Sometimes we simply need to trust our utmost, deepest intuitions and the wisdom that pours forth from the heart of our hearts. This is not a license to reckless and warrantless superstition and escapism. It is a license to humility, wisdom, and well-being. Sometimes too much logic and rigid empiricism is just a license for reckless stupidity. I fear if mankind enters into this next era without having undergone this kind of spiritual development, then this technology may be used by the select worldly few to capture man via his deep longing for a spiritual life. His natural spiritual impulses may be used and channeled into simulated realities which can never fulfill the deep spiritual longing within him. One which was undoubtedly imprinted within him by God, Brahman, cosmos, natural selection, or whatever you believe in. It does not matter. What matters is that if we have an innate nature, And if we think we can reorganize or tamper with that nature, we may very well sow our own misery and destruction. Human happiness and well-being cannot be measured by and reduced to quantities and information. This is where I'd like to step back for a moment and revisit our earlier question, except this time with a bit of a twist. In thinking of the aforementioned pencil, if I were to ask you to point to the spirit of the pencil, where would you point? Indeed, what is the difference between information and spirit? What is the difference between the information of the pencil and the spirit of the pencil? You see, like the term information, the term spirit, just like the notion of a soul, can also refer to something seemingly immaterial or non-tangible. It therefore appears to me to be the ultimate irony of the legacy of materialism that the limitations of a purely material conception of the world was ultimately met with the invention of an effectively new mental substance. This is a new mental substance by which we are now describing the world in terms of, just as we once described the world in terms of spirit. The only difference is this mental substance of information is not expressed in terms of qualities and subjective essences, intuitions, feelings, and sensations, but in terms of mathematically objective quantities. Expressed psychologically, we went from describing the world in terms of one set of cogitations to another set of cogitations. Broadly speaking, we went from describing the world in terms of spirit to describing it in terms of information. You see, as far as I can tell, the fundamental distinction between spirit and information is this. Spirit is to essential qualities, as information is to essential quantities. Here, the word essence implies that we seek to distill things down to their simplest forms. There is a reason why physics reduces complex equations down to simple ones. We seemingly have an innate drive towards simplicity, as it's easier for the mind to grapple with. With simple equations, feelings, or sensations, it is easy to process, expand, contrast, and condense into different equations, feelings, or sensations. Therefore, seeking the spirit or qualitative essence of something can be considered imperative for the development of one's mind, and for the comprehension of the phenomenal world. A world of information cannot tell us of essential qualities, and a world of spiritual essences, of feelings, sensations, and intuitions cannot tell us about standard form equations. As I mentioned earlier, these are two dimensions of our phenomenology which mirror each other, but we cannot genuinely convert one into the other. And there's no guarantee that we will ever be able to do so. They are two entirely different methods of cognition, two different philosophies. The danger, therefore, lies in a matter of imbalance between the two. More so, there is another facet to this problem which is of significant concern to me. The issue which appears to plague the modern world is not always a simple lack of wisdom, but a prideful clinging to certain philosophical doctrine and dogma. Often it is a clinging to things perhaps best outgrown. The departure from metaphysics in the late 19th century, which was made upon the complaint of the transcendent components, actually came with ramifications to it. People often see no reason anymore to consider metaphysical and spiritual ideas, and indeed such ideas are often conflated as superstitions or nonsensical fairy tales, and in doing so, they fail to adequately develop the cognitive capacity to see things as essential, qualitative, unified wholes. They reject these spiritual methods of contemplation by such erroneous assumptions. You see, as we will explore in just a moment, spirit, just like the term information, does not necessarily imply anything beyond the domain of the phenomenal world. But just like the term information, it certainly can and has been used in this way. It is a word with an extensive etymology. Again, in a previous video, we explored the works of Dr. Ian McGilchrist, who has shown that the average state of modern man's psychology effectively exhibits functional brain damage to the right hemisphere. Such individuals tend to only see reality as abstract things and never an interconnected whole. Reality is understood through the metaphor of mechanisms and not complex organic processes and things of the like. When one therefore rejects any spiritual contemplation, as many do today, then we lose some degree of capacity to develop a refined sense of interconnected qualities, likenesses, and structures of the like. Such individuals cannot therefore process the qualitative dimension of phenomenology in any adept degree. They condemn themselves to remain closely upon the surface levels of language as a predefined set of rules and meanings. These individuals cannot adequately stretch the boundaries of their minds, as might be said of the poet, musician, philosopher, or mystic. There is therefore a self-imposed limitation. Such an individual is essentially bound by chains which they cannot see nor hear, because the capacity to perceive their own bondage is obtained only by the development of the modalities of thought which they reject to begin with. They therefore cannot come to see the reality of their own bondage unless by happenstance or change of heart. They are, in some sense, trapped within a maze and are struggling to find their way out. It is, expressed in other terms, the development of higher or more refined, subtle states of consciousness, which allows one to see the unseen, and thus metacognitively reflect upon oneself, thereby granting themselves the capacity to navigate beyond the maze. This line of thought, however, drives somewhere which is subject for another video, and in returning to these similarities and distinctions between spirit and information, I'd again like for us to observe that the term spirit, like information, does not necessarily need to possess a transcendent or noumenal dimension to it. In my mind, there was one such individual who had essentially come to a very similar view of Shannon's observer information long prior to modern computation. Here I am referring to George Wilhelm Hegel and his notion of Geist, or as translated into English, spirit. Unlike traditional religious notions, for Hegel, spirit is not conceived as a supernatural, otherworldly force, essence, or deity that exists independently of the natural world. Rather, it is something wholly present within human beings themselves without any noumenal or Platonic dimensionality. It is present within and of human consciousness, regardless of its fundamental nature. Spirit may therefore be considered as emergent from human existence, consciousness, and activity, and this can be understood in psychological terms even if one is something of a epiphenomenalist or a material reductionist. It is an idea which manifests in self-conscious human minds as we grasp universal concepts through reason and philosophy. This spirit is reflected within culture through art, literature, and religion, which all express the self-understanding of a people. It may be understood as the self-reflective essence or image of mankind's collective consciousness, and it can be understood as a sensation, feeling, or deeply held knowing of the essential qualities which comprise this spirit. It is mankind coming to know the nature of himself through himself in a deeply qualitative sense. For object and subject were two sides of the same absolute spirit for Hegel. To synthesize everything I have presented in this video, it's here that I'd like to present what seems to be the core similarities and distinctions between spirit and information. In doing so, let's observe both the symmetrical and asymmetrical aspects of them. Symmetrically, both need not posit anything beyond phenomenality. Both ultimately constitute and describe the world in terms of mental categories. In both attempt to see the world monistically as a unified whole. Asymmetrically, information describes phenomenality through quantities, where spirit describes phenomenality through qualities. The informational view is focused upon narrow isolations of reality, whereas the spiritual view is focused upon the broad picture and generalities. Information, under the commonly held view of physicalism, holds that the world is constituted by matter, even though we describe that matter through our mental quantities. One may say that this view presents a rift in man's understanding of phenomenality, which is evidenced in the hard problem of consciousness. Spirit, on the other hand, sees the world in terms of consciousness and mentation itself. It is self-enclosing, for when viewed from the epistemic foundation as opposed to an ontic one, we are consciousnesses before we are physical beings. This is all to say, describing the world in terms of spirit need not deny the world in terms of physics and information. Which is to say, just as an informational view of reality does not necessitate the denial of consciousness, a spiritual view does not necessitate a denial of the physical in some sense. The difference lay more subtly in the ontological foundation. Hegel saw the entirety of reality, both physical and mental, as grounded in and constituted by a single all-encompassing abstract principle, the absolute spirit. Again, let us observe that this view of reality shares an identical relation with Giulio Tonini's philosophy, which has been the basis for integrated information theory, a notion, again, that has been supported by much of contemporary physics. For Tonini, consciousness is information, and information is consciousness. There is no gap, they are one and the same. It seems to me that Hegel was expressing the same exact notion far before our modern notion of information. For both Hegel and Tonini, it would seem that both affirm the following identity. Information is equal to consciousness, and consciousness is equal to information. The difference lay in that Tonini is primarily describing consciousness in terms of information, and Hegel was primarily describing aggregated information in terms of consciousness or spirit. The great irony here is therefore that we have arrived at the same essential worldview, only expressed in two different ways. Again, one is isolative, discrete, and quantitative. the other broad, continuous, and qualitative. Why not hold both? In closing, my friends, I think we find that there are very real forces which exist within the cosmos which are not capable of physical description. They are capable of identification and description only through the categories of the human mind. And more so, there are many such forces that seem to present themselves to the mind when viewed allegorically, metaphorically, and conceptually, and therefore metaphysically. Such a way of viewing the world amounts to a spiritual perspective, regardless of any genuine Platonic dimensionality, though we should not be surprised if there is a world which exists beyond the domain of our senses. One might say that there is a kind of telos which is manifesting itself in the consciousness of man, and not in any necessarily anthropocentric view, quite the opposite really. There is perhaps a story encoded in the fabric of the cosmos. There is, perhaps as Hegel understood, a kind of historical dialectic in which all things and no things are a part of. Well has it been said that we are the universe coming to know itself. In the final analysis, all of it may be seen as one field, one cosmos, one mind, one knowing. In my view, where man finds himself today, there is a deep rift and divide within our collective consciousness. A house divided cannot stand, and at any moment it can collapse, leaving all we have wrought for posterity. The fissure that the materialist mechanistic legacy of the Descartian era has left us with appears to have stranded mankind in dangerous waters. If every thesis finds its end in the beginning of its antithesis, and every antithesis finds its end in the beginning of a synthesis, it therefore seems to me, my friends, that our generations have inherited the archetypal role of the healer. Therefore, it seems to me that we need to unite these disparate dimensions of man's phenomenology. Mankind must once again develop a spiritual dimension to himself, and a reverence for the sacred gift of imagination, and warm up to the idea that we may very well be living in a cosmos infinitely larger than our wildest of imaginations. Metaphysics must once again return to our academic institutions and our popular culture. Transcendent ideals must once again beckon us towards higher heights. We must decide to see the commonality within each other before our differences once again. As the great idealistic sages, mystics, and spiritual leaders of the past understood, all things find their beginning and end in the crucible of the heart. Much love, my friends. Be safe out there.